Cop slams elderly black man against car. Blood drains when he sees U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Henry Thompson, an elderly man in his late 70s, was enjoying such a day. He had always liked these walks, not just for exercise, but because they gave him a chance to greet neighbors and see the little things that made life beautiful. A child's laughter, the aroma of freshly baked bread, or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Henry was a man who carried himself with dignity. Though his steps were slow, they were steady, and there was a calm confidence in the way he moved. Many in the neighborhood knew him, though not everyone knew the full story of his life. Henry had spent decades working in law, serving as a judge, and later as a U.S. Supreme Court justice. He had made decisions that affected the lives of millions, yet he never flaunted his achievements. To him, it was never about recognition, but about doing what was right. Today, he walked down Maple Street carrying a small paper bag from the grocery store, his mind enjoying the ordinary joys of life. As Henry approached the corner, he noticed a patrol car slowly moving along the road. At first, he didn't pay much attention. Police cars were a common sight after all, and he had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But then, the car stopped abruptly, tires squealing slightly on the asphalt. A young officer stepped out, moving quickly toward Henry. The officer's expression was tense, his steps hurried. "Sir, please stop right there," the officer said, his voice firm. Henry raised his hands slightly, showing he had no intention of causing trouble. "I'm just walking home, officer," Henry said politely. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer didn't seem convinced. Perhaps it was Henry's age, perhaps it was the color of his skin, or maybe it was just an ordinary day that had put the officer on edge. Whatever the reason, the officer suddenly grabbed Henry by the arm and pushed him against a parked car. The metal pressed cold against Henry's back, and he winced in surprise and discomfort. "Please, sir, I'm not resisting." "I'm just walking home," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. The officer ignored him, speaking instead into his radio. His hands were steady, but there was an unease in his eyes, a hint that he wasn't entirely sure what he had found. Henry felt the blood drain from his face, not just from fear, but from the shock of the situation. He had seen police officers in his career, of course, and had even worked alongside them during legal matters, but this was different. This was personal, and yet completely random. Neighbors began to notice. A few cautious faces peeked from behind curtains. A woman walking her dog stopped at a distance, unsure whether to intervene or call for help. The air was tense, thick with the suddenness of the confrontation. Henry's mind raced. He had to remain calm. He had faced far greater challenges in courtrooms full of powerful people, and he had always relied on patience and reason to navigate them. He could do the same now. "Sir, can I see some identification?" the officer asked, still holding Henry against the car. Henry reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside, carefully folded, was a card that no one would have expected in this situation. A card indicating he was a retired U.S. Supreme Court justice. He handed it to the officer, keeping his expression neutral. For a moment, the officer didn't speak. His eyes widened slightly as he looked at the card. The hand that had pressed so firmly against Henry's arm trembled slightly. For the first time, the officer's confidence faltered, replaced by uncertainty and surprise. Henry remained calm, not taking advantage of the moment, but waiting for the officer to process what he had just seen. Around them, the street seemed to hold its breath. The small crowd of neighbors grew, curious and concerned. Some had already pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. It was a quiet street, not used to moments of tension, yet the energy of the scene was palpable. Henry felt the eyes of the community upon him, not in judgment, but in solidarity. People were witnessing something extraordinary. A man who had dedicated his life to justice, now in a situation where he was treated like a stranger, a suspect, a person to be feared rather than respected. The officer swallowed hard, clearly struggling to regain his composure. I didn't know," he stammered. His voice lacked the earlier authority. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. Henry, calm and collected, stood upright, showing that true dignity doesn't come from force but from self-control. "You didn't know what?" Henry asked softly, not with anger but with curiosity. "That I didn't know who you were," the officer admitted, his face flushed with embarrassment. I thought," he trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Henry nodded slowly, understanding that this was a human moment. People make mistakes, sometimes serious ones, and the important thing is how they respond afterward. He didn't want humiliation for anyone. He wanted acknowledgement of the truth and perhaps a lesson to be learned. The tension in the air began to ease slightly. The neighbors, who had been holding their breath, now whispered quietly among themselves. Some nodded at Henry, expressing silent support. Others looked at the officer with a mix of surprise and concern, unsure how he would handle the delicate situation he now faced. Henry adjusted the bag in his hand, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He spoke again in a tone that was calm but carried the weight of his experience. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is that we recognize them and correct them. It's never too late to do the right thing." The officer looked at him, eyes downcast. He seemed to absorb the words, realizing that this was not a confrontation but a teaching moment. His grip on Henry's arm loosened, and he stepped back, taking a breath to steady himself. The street slowly returned to normal. The neighbors, who had been watching closely, began to retreat to their homes, though many lingered to see how the situation would conclude. Henry stood quietly, composed, showing the strength that comes from a lifetime of service and integrity. The officer, still processing what had happened, finally spoke with a steadier voice. I'm very sorry, sir," he said. "I should have handled this differently." Henry nodded once, acknowledging the apology. "Thank you," he replied. "I appreciate that. Let this be a lesson for both of us." With that, the officer returned to his car, visibly shaken but seemingly more aware of the human side of his duty. Henry resumed his walk home, each step deliberate, carrying not just groceries but a quiet reminder to the community of the power of dignity, patience, and calm in the face of unexpected challenges. By the time Henry reached his house, the story of what had happened had already begun to spread. Neighbors shared their accounts, and soon, the incident would reach far beyond the quiet streets of Maple Street. It would become a symbol, not of anger or fear, but of how respect and patience can prevail, even in moments when misunderstanding threatens to overwhelm. For Henry, it was a simple walk home. But for the world watching, it was a profound moment, a reminder that true strength is shown not in confrontation, but in the quiet assertion of one's dignity and the example set for others to follow. After the incident on Maple Street, word of what had happened began to spread. Like wildfire, neighbors talked in hushed tones, some still shocked that a quiet man like Henry Thompson had been treated roughly by a police officer. Others were relieved that Henry had handled the situation with calm dignity, knowing that not everyone could remain so composed under such stress. But despite the immediate relief, the story was far from over. Within hours, videos recorded by neighbors began circulating on social media. The footage showed Henry being pressed against the car, the tension in his posture, and the moment when the officer noticed the card identifying him as a retired U.S. Supreme Court justice. People were drawn to the stark contrast between Henry's calm demeanor and the officer's sudden panic. Comments poured in from across the country, expressing disbelief, sympathy, and admiration. Many highlighted the irony. A man who had spent his life defending the law had been treated as if he were a criminal. Henry, meanwhile, was back in the quiet of his home, trying to process the sudden attention. He sat in his favorite armchair, hands folded over his lap, reflecting on the afternoon's events. Despite the fear and humiliation he had briefly felt, he didn't dwell on anger. Instead, he thought about the larger lesson the moment represented. "Even those tasked with upholding the law can make mistakes," he murmured to himself. "And sometimes, the greatest impact comes from patience and understanding rather than confrontation." The officer, whose name was Officer Daniel Reed, felt a growing pressure from his department and the public. Internal Affairs had already opened an investigation, and his superiors had begun questioning him about the encounter. He couldn't shake the image of Henry, calm and composed, as he had fumbled with the badge. It was a moment that would stay with him, a stark reminder of how quickly authority could turn into embarrassment when judgment was clouded. In the days following the incident, the neighborhood buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Children would wave at Henry as he walked down the street, parents would stop to greet him, and even strangers began approaching him with polite inquiries. Many expressed how inspiring it was to see someone react with dignity under pressure, especially someone of his stature. Henry, humble as ever, always deflected praise, insisting that he had only acted as he believed any decent person should. Local reporters soon arrived at Henry's home, seeking interviews. Henry welcomed them not to boast, but to share the story as a lesson for the broader community. He spoke in simple, measured sentences, emphasizing the importance of respect, understanding, and patience. "We can't control the actions of others," he said, "but we can control how we respond. And sometimes a calm response can change a situation entirely." Officer Reed, meanwhile, faced the difficult task of addressing both public scrutiny and his own conscience. At first, he avoided social media and news coverage, overwhelmed by guilt and uncertainty. He replayed the video in his mind repeatedly, wishing he could undo the actions of that afternoon. But as the days passed, he realized that avoiding responsibility would only make matters worse. The officer decided to request a meeting with Henry, hoping to apologize in person and learn from the experience. The meeting was arranged at a small community center in the neighborhood. It was a neutral space, chosen so that both men could speak freely without distractions. Henry arrived first, greeting the officer with a calm nod. Reed followed, visibly nervous, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The room was quiet, charged with anticipation, yet Henry's presence brought a sense of ease. "I want to apologize," Officer Reed began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I acted without thinking. I let my assumptions guide my actions, and I treated you unfairly. I am truly sorry." Henry listened carefully, his expression soft but attentive. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "It takes courage to admit a mistake. What matters now is what you do next, how you carry this lesson forward." For the next hour, Henry shared stories from his career, explaining how justice was not just about laws, but about understanding and empathy. He spoke of cases where careful listening had made the difference between fairness and injustice. Officer Reed listened intently, absorbing every word, realizing that his brief lapse could have been far more damaging if Henry had reacted differently. The conversation shifted from apology to education. Henry emphasized the importance of seeing each person as an individual beyond appearances or assumptions. He spoke of the value of patience, the power of calm reasoning, and the responsibility that comes with authority. "Authority without understanding can be dangerous," Henry said softly, "but authority guided by empathy can inspire respect and trust." As the meeting concluded, Officer Reed's demeanor had changed. The tension in his shoulders had eased, and a sense of responsibility replaced his earlier embarrassment. He thanked Henry, promising to reflect on the experience and to improve his interactions with the public. For Henry, it was not about forgiveness alone. It was about ensuring that the lesson extended beyond a single apology. Meanwhile, the community responded with overwhelming support for Henry. Local news outlets highlighted his composure, praising the way he handled a difficult and potentially humiliating situation. People shared stories of how Henry's calmness had inspired them to reconsider how they dealt with conflict in their own lives. Social media campaigns celebrated his patience and wisdom, turning what could have been a moment of anger into a story of hope and guidance. In the days that followed, neighborhood residents organized a small gathering to honor Henry. They wanted to express their admiration not for his position as a former Supreme Court justice, but for the example he had set. People of all ages came together, sharing food, laughter, and stories. Children listened intently as Henry spoke about his experiences, learning about fairness, patience, and dignity in a way no classroom could teach. The gathering also became an opportunity for dialogue about community, policing, and respect. Officer Reed attended as well, showing that learning and growth were ongoing processes. He listened as neighbors shared their concerns and experiences, realizing that his brief encounter with Henry had opened his eyes to the broader responsibilities of his role. As the weeks passed, the story continued to gain attention. News outlets covered it nationwide, framing it as a reminder of how respect and patience can transform moments of conflict. Commentators highlighted the lesson that authority must always be tempered with understanding, and that even those who hold great power can be reminded of humility through unexpected experiences. Henry returned to his daily routine, walking the streets of his neighborhood with a renewed sense of connection. People greeted him warmly, and the air seemed lighter, filled with a shared understanding of respect and kindness. He continued to meet with community members, offering guidance and sharing stories, not seeking recognition, but hoping that the lessons would inspire others. The officer, now more mindful and thoughtful, began implementing changes in his work. He sought training in community engagement, learning to approach situations with empathy and understanding. The experience had transformed him, not through punishment or fear, but through the quiet strength and patience demonstrated by Henry Thompson. Through it all, Henry remained humble. He didn't seek accolades or headlines. He simply lived by the principles he had spent a lifetime upholding: justice, patience, and dignity. Yet the impact of his actions extended far beyond his own life. Communities began to discuss the importance of understanding and respect. Officers reflected on their responsibilities, and neighbors learned that even small gestures of calmness and patience could create ripples of positive change. In the end, the incident on Maple Street became more than just a story of confrontation. It became a story of learning, growth, and humanity. Henry's composure had turned a moment of fear into a lesson for a community and a nation. Officer Reed's apology and willingness to learn showed that mistakes could be transformed into opportunities for betterment. And the neighborhood, inspired by both men, grew closer, recognizing that patience, respect, and understanding were as important as any law or rule. As Henry walked home each evening, he noticed small changes in the world around him. Neighbors waved more often, conversations were warmer, and even strangers offered smiles of kindness. He thought about the young officer, hoping that he would carry the lesson forward in every interaction. Most importantly, he reflected on the truth that had guided him through a lifetime. That dignity and patience, even in the face of fear or injustice, could change hearts, minds, and ultimately, the world around him. Weeks had passed since the incident on Maple Street, but the story of Henry Thompson and Officer Daniel Reed had not faded. In fact, it had gained momentum. The footage of Henry being pressed against the car and the moment the officer realized who he was had gone viral. People across the country were talking about it, sharing their opinions and reflecting on the lessons it offered. Some saw it as a wake-up call about respect, others as a moment to examine how society treats elderly citizens and minorities. The irony of a retired Supreme Court justice facing such a confrontation had struck a chord with many. Henry, however, did not let the attention change him. He continued his daily walks, greeted neighbors, and spent time reading and reflecting in his study. He understood that the attention was temporary, but the opportunity to teach something lasting was permanent. He was careful not to speak for recognition, but to offer insight and reflection. "This is not about me," he often said to himself. "It's about showing what respect, patience, and calmness can accomplish in the world." Meanwhile, Officer Reed was experiencing his own transformation. The public scrutiny, internal review by the police department, and the personal realization of his mistake weighed heavily on him. He reflected often on how quickly fear and assumptions had guided his actions, and how differently things might have gone if Henry had reacted with anger or panic. The thought unsettled him, driving a desire to understand, learn, and make amends. The turning point came when a national news outlet contacted Henry for a formal interview. They wanted to cover not just the incident, but the lessons it embodied: justice, patience, and human dignity. Henry agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to educate a wider audience. He spoke with clarity, humility, and depth. "It is important to remember," he said, "that respect is not automatic. It must be shown, understood, and shared. Authority alone does not earn it. Actions guided by empathy and understanding do." The interview was broadcast nationally, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands wrote messages expressing admiration for Henry, sharing stories of their own experiences with injustice, and reflecting on how they might act differently in tense situations. Communities held local discussions, using the incident as a framework for conversations about respect, authority, and human dignity. Teachers discussed it with students, neighbors debated it in local gatherings, and even law enforcement agencies examined it as a case study in community relations. Amid the growing attention, Henry felt it was time to take a more direct step with Officer Reed. He invited the young officer to join him in a community workshop on empathy and understanding. This was more than a private conversation. It was a structured session designed to teach lessons that extended beyond a single mistake. Reed hesitated at first, nervous about public judgment, but he agreed, understanding that this was a chance to learn in a meaningful way. The workshop was held at a small town hall, packed with residents, community leaders, and local officials. Henry began by recounting his experience, not to emphasize the confrontation, but to illustrate the impact of assumptions and the power of calm, patient responses. He spoke about moments in his legal career when listening and understanding had resolved conflicts, sometimes preventing harm before it began. He emphasized that authority must always be balanced with empathy, and that every individual, regardless of age, background, or position, deserved respect. Officer Reed listened attentively, realizing that the lesson went far beyond his initial mistake. The stories Henry shared were not abstract ideas. They were practical lessons about how people respond to fear, pressure, and authority. He began to see that his initial reaction on Maple Street was not simply a minor lapse, but a reflection of a larger issue: the importance of awareness, patience, and training in dealing with diverse communities. As the workshop continued, Henry invited participants to share their own experiences with authority, judgment, and misunderstanding. Residents told stories of conflicts that could have escalated if someone had not exercised patience or understanding. Some shared personal anecdotes about family members, school experiences, or encounters with law enforcement. Each story reinforced the central lesson: calm, thoughtful responses can prevent harm and foster trust. Officer Reed found himself reflecting deeply. The faces of the participants, the sincerity of their stories, and the weight of his own past actions combined to create a moment of profound realization. He began to understand that mistakes were not just personal failures. They were opportunities to grow, educate, and prevent future harm. By the end of the workshop, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility and a commitment to act differently in the future. After the session, Henry and Officer Reed stayed behind to speak privately. Reed admitted, "I never realized how much a single moment could affect someone's life, even if it's brief. I was focused on procedure, on rules, and I forgot the human side of my job. Seeing how you handled it, it has changed my perspective completely." Henry nodded, offering reassurance. "It is not too late to learn," he said. "What matters is that you carry this lesson forward in every encounter. Authority should guide, not intimidate. Understanding should lead, not assumptions. That is how change happens, one choice at a time." This interaction marked a turning point not just for Reed, but for the community. Local leaders praised the initiative, highlighting the importance of education and reflection. Law enforcement officials began discussing new programs aimed at increasing empathy, awareness, and cultural understanding among officers. The story of Henry Thompson became a case study in how individual actions can inspire systemic change. Henry's personal life, too, reflected the impact of the incident. Neighbors invited him to community meetings, schools asked him to speak to students, and residents sought his guidance in conflict resolution. Though he did not seek fame, the attention offered him a platform to teach, and he embraced it with humility. Each interaction emphasized the same message: dignity, patience, and understanding can transform even the most tense situations. As the months passed, Henry and Officer Reed continued to collaborate on community initiatives. They visited schools, participated in discussions on justice and authority, and helped organize workshops on conflict resolution. Their partnership became a symbol of reconciliation and growth, showing that mistakes could be transformed into lessons and bridges rather than barriers. The broader media attention continued to highlight the story. National commentators analyzed the incident, emphasizing its lessons for communities across the country. They focused on the power of calmness, the importance of humility and authority, and the ability of one individual to inspire reflection and change. Henry's quiet strength, combined with Reed's willingness to learn, created a narrative that resonated with people from all walks of life. Henry's life returned to a sense of normalcy, but he remained aware of the lasting impact of the events. Every walk down the street, every conversation with neighbors, and every workshop he attended reinforced the central lesson. True influence comes not from fear or power, but from patience, understanding, and the courage to act with integrity even when faced with disrespect or Misunderstanding. The turning point of this story was clear. A moment of potential conflict had transformed into an opportunity for learning, growth, and community connection. Henry's calm composure and the willingness of Officer Reed to accept responsibility became a model for how individuals and communities could respond to mistakes, not with anger or punishment alone, but with education, reflection, and constructive action. The community itself began to change. Residents became more aware of the importance of respect in daily interactions. Children observed not just Henry's status as a former justice, but his behavior, how he listened, responded calmly, and treated everyone with dignity. Adults reflected on their own assumptions and biases, seeking ways to act with patience and understanding. Even local law enforcement officers began reporting changes in how they approached interactions, inspired by the lessons of Maple Street. In the midst of all this attention, Henry remained humble. He did not allow the story to define him. Instead, he used it as a tool to teach, to inspire, and to remind people that even small, deliberate choices could create ripples of positive change. The turning point of the incident, the moment when Officer Reed realized who he was, had sparked a chain of events that went far beyond a single afternoon. It had inspired reflection, growth, and dialogue that would continue for years. Through it all, Henry maintained his simple routines. He walked the streets, greeted neighbors, and spent quiet hours in his study. Yet the world around him had shifted. What had begun as a moment of tension had become a movement of understanding. The officer who had once acted in haste now stood as a testament to the power of reflection and education. The community had come together, inspired by one man's patience and another man's willingness to learn. And so, the turning point in Henry Thompson's story was not just about recognition or apology. It was about transformation. It was about how a single encounter could teach lessons far beyond its immediate circumstances. It was about how dignity, patience, and calm resolve could change hearts, minds, and even communities. Most importantly, it was a reminder that even in moments of fear, misunderstanding, or conflict, humanity and empathy could guide the way, leaving a lasting impact on everyone involved. The months following the incident on Maple Street were filled with reflection, learning, and growth. Henry Thompson, though now widely known across the country for what had happened, remained grounded in his quiet, deliberate life. He continued his daily walks, greeted neighbors warmly, and spent his mornings reading the newspaper and legal journals. Yet every step he took was accompanied by the knowledge that the moment on the street had left an impression far greater than he could have imagined. The story of Henry and Officer Daniel Reed had become more than just a viral news item. It had evolved into a symbol of patience, dignity, and the transformative power of empathy. Communities discussed it, schools used it as a lesson in civics and respect, and law enforcement agencies shared it as a case study in proper community engagement. It was a reminder that respect is earned through understanding, not assumed by position or authority, and that every interaction, no matter how brief, carries the potential to shape perceptions and relationships. Henry knew that the true impact of the incident was not in the attention it brought to him, but in the change it inspired in others. He received letters and messages daily, from young people seeking guidance, from officers asking how to handle tense situations, and from neighbors sharing how they had altered their behavior after witnessing his composure. Each letter, each conversation, reminded him that what might seem like a small, quiet act of patience could ripple outward in ways he had never imagined. Officer Reed had also changed profoundly. The young officer who had once acted hastily and without consideration now approached his duties with a newfound sense of responsibility and mindfulness. He often thought back to that afternoon on Maple Street, the weight of Henry's calm presence lingering in his mind. The officer now actively sought training in empathy, communication, and community relations. He began to mentor other officers, sharing the lessons he had learned and emphasizing that authority alone is insufficient. Understanding and respect are essential. The two men continued to collaborate on initiatives designed to foster community trust and education. They visited schools together, speaking to students about justice, responsibility, and the importance of empathy in everyday life. They held workshops where citizens could engage with law enforcement officers in open dialogue, discussing concerns and sharing perspectives. Each session was a reminder that meaningful change often begins with conversation and a willingness to learn from one another. One day, Henry received an invitation from a national legal conference to speak about his experiences and the lessons they held for the broader society. He accepted, viewing it not as an opportunity for recognition, but as a chance to reach a larger audience with a message of patience, humility, and understanding. When he took the stage, the room fell silent, eager to hear from a man whose life had been devoted to justice and whose actions had now become a living example of its principles. Henry spoke in his calm, measured tone, recounting not just the incident itself, but the lessons it had taught him, Officer Reed, and the community. He emphasized that true justice is not only about laws and rulings, but about how people treat one another in their daily lives. Every interaction, he said, is a chance to show respect, understanding, and humanity. When we act with patience and empathy, we create an environment where trust and fairness can flourish. The audience listened attentively, taking in each word. Legal professionals, educators, and community leaders alike were inspired by the story of Maple Street, not just for the dramatic encounter, but for the positive outcomes that had followed. They understood that the moment of conflict had been transformed into a teaching tool, demonstrating that even mistakes, when handled thoughtfully, can become opportunities for growth and improvement. Back in his own community, Henry continued to live modestly, never seeking personal gain from his newfound recognition. Neighbors treated him with the same warmth as before, though now with added admiration. Children often ran to greet him during his walks, curious about the man who had handled a tense situation with such grace. Parents shared his story with their families, emphasizing lessons of patience and respect that could be applied in homes, schools, and workplaces alike. Officer Reed, too, found a sense of fulfillment in the changes that had come about. His relationship with the community improved dramatically as he applied the lessons he had learned from Henry. People noticed his attentiveness, his willingness to listen, and his genuine efforts to understand perspectives different from his own. The officer realized that his mistake had become a turning point not only for him personally, but for the way he approached every interaction with the public. Together, Henry and Reed began documenting their experiences and insights in a guide for community engagement. The guide was intended for law enforcement officers, educators, and community leaders, providing practical advice on how to foster understanding, manage conflicts, and promote respectful interactions. It emphasized reflection, empathy, and communication as key tools in building stronger, safer communities. The guide was well received, adopted by several law enforcement agencies, and discussed in professional development workshops. It highlighted the power of individual actions and the importance of learning from mistakes. Henry often reminded readers that the true measure of influence is not power or position, but the ability to inspire thoughtful, positive behavior in others. Despite all the attention and recognition, Henry remained humble. He returned to his quiet routine, tending to his garden, reading, and enjoying simple walks through the neighborhood. Yet he carried with him a sense of fulfillment, knowing that what had begun as a moment of fear and misunderstanding had blossomed into something meaningful for so many people. His example continued to teach lessons of patience, integrity, and dignity that extended far beyond the street where the incident had occurred. The local community organized a small ceremony in Henry's honor. Neighbors gathered to celebrate his contributions, not just as a retired Supreme Court justice, but as a man who embodied the principles of justice and empathy in daily life. Henry accepted the recognition with humility, insisting that the true reward was seeing the community embrace the values of respect and understanding. Children decorated the park with handmade banners, neighbors shared heartfelt speeches, and the atmosphere was filled with warmth and gratitude. As the ceremony concluded, Officer Reed approached Henry, his expression one of genuine respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "You taught me more in that afternoon than I could have learned in years of training. I will carry these lessons with me for the rest of my career." Henry smiled, placing a gentle hand on the officer's shoulder. "The lessons are not mine alone," he replied. "We all learn from one another, and the true measure of our actions is the impact they have on others. Keep learning, keep listening, and you will continue to make a difference." The story of Maple Street soon became part of broader discussions about justice, empathy, and human dignity. Educators used it to teach children about respect and patience. Community leaders referenced it in programs aimed at building trust between citizens and law enforcement. Law enforcement agencies incorporated it into training, emphasizing the importance of awareness, empathy, and thoughtful decision-making. For Henry, the most satisfying part of the journey was knowing that his actions, and his calm response to a tense situation, had sparked meaningful change. He had transformed what could have been a story of conflict and fear into a story of learning, growth, and community connection. His life, once private and quiet, had become a model for how patience, dignity, and integrity could influence others in profound ways. As the weeks and months continued, Henry walked through his neighborhood with a quiet pride. He observed small changes, the way neighbors greeted one another, the attention given to children crossing the street, and the polite interactions between citizens and local law enforcement. These moments, though subtle, were signs that the lessons of Maple Street were taking root. Henry often reflected on the fact that what had seemed like a minor, frightening moment had the power to create ripples far beyond his imagination. A single incident, handled with patience and understanding, had inspired education, reflection, and change at a community and national level. It was proof that even small, deliberate choices could have far-reaching consequences when guided by empathy and integrity. Officer Reed continued his journey as well. He shared the story of Maple Street with colleagues, emphasizing how a brief encounter could teach lasting lessons. He advocated for training programs that focused on empathy, communication, and awareness, helping officers develop skills that went beyond procedure and rules. His own growth became a testament to the power of learning from mistakes and taking responsibility for one's actions. Together, Henry and Reed occasionally revisited the street where it all began. They would walk slowly, reflecting on the events, sharing observations, and discussing ways to continue promoting understanding in their community. These walks were quiet, filled with reflection and mutual respect, a symbol of the journey from conflict to connection. In the end, the story of Henry Thompson and Maple Street was not defined by fear, confrontation, or social media attention. It was defined by the calm strength of a man who upheld dignity in the face of misunderstanding, and the willingness of another to learn, grow, and act differently. It was a story of patience, empathy, and the ripple effect that one thoughtful response can create. Henry returned home one evening, the sun setting gently across the rooftops. He paused at his front door, taking a deep breath and feeling the quiet satisfaction of a life that had made a difference. He thought of the lessons he had taught, the change he had inspired, and the way a single moment of calmness could create ripples far beyond expectation. And in that quiet, simple reflection, he knew that the true measure of a life well lived was not fame, recognition, or accolades, but the positive impact one had on others, through patience, understanding, and integrity. And so the story came full circle. From a moment of tension and fear to a journey of learning, growth, and transformation, Henry Thompson's life remained a testament to the power of dignity, empathy, and the courage to act with patience, even in the most challenging circumstances. The lessons of Maple Street would continue to inspire generations, reminding all who heard it that respect, understanding, and calm resolve are the true foundations of justice and humanity.